Hey there, and welcome to the fifth tutorial in the Python series, Python Basics, Getting Started. This tutorial is about loops and logic, and I'm going to try something and see if it works out here. To make this work, you're going to need some kind of text editor. There are lots out there. I have found Notepad++ to be pretty nice. If you let it know that you're doing something in the Python programming language, it does some automatic formatting that just makes your code look a little bit nicer. So if you don't have that already, download Notepad++ or whatever you prefer. You can just open up a regular Notepad and start there. But you'll need some kind of text editor because we're going to move off of the interactive session and into an actual program, because that's where most of your writing is going to go. You're going to actually write a program, and we'll figure out how to execute it at the command line. All right, well, so you can see I've got a program opened. I'm writing a program I'm gonna call myprogram.py. There's the normal Python extension for a Python file, and I'm gonna start this program like I start most of them. I'm gonna do some imports, and the only reason I start them all like this is because I often need these things. So whether I need them or not, I'm going to put them in there this time. And maybe that's bad programming, but that's how I do it. So I start with import sys and import OOS. All right, so we got our Python program started. So this series is called Loops and Logic. So the reason that you do programming almost at all is because you want to have a machine do something that it can do much faster and much more orderly than you can do yourself. And that's what I like about programming. So the loops and logic are the guts of programming to me. In Python, there's lots of ways to loop through data. First, you're going to need some data to work with. So let's start with just a list. We'll have, and again, I'm trying to give you some of the information about the Python programming language as we go here. So, you'll forgive me if this gets a little slow and boring. Python is based on an idea, at least it was designed around the idea of code readability. That was highly emphasized in how it was created. And so we're going to embrace that here, and we're going to make our parameter names something that is encourages that code readability. And we're going to show how Python can take advantage of some of that structure. So we'll start with something called list underscore of underscore names, and we'll just we'll make that a list. So in this editor, when I enter in a right square bracket, it automatically puts in a left one for me, which is kind of nice. Some other thing that's nice about Python is that you can take your container and you can break it across lines, and Python is okay with that. And so if I wanted to, I can make my list of names like this, where I can tab over here and I can start writing something. I can write the name Bob and put a comma, and then I can hit return. I can go to the next line. Again, the editor here automatically tabs forward for me, which is nice. And so we'll say another name, Jim, Frank. Oops. Well, yeah, I could have used double quotes there. Doesn't matter. Frank. I'm using single quotes here. So each name in my list, I'm gonna put there, and so I've got my container closed off. Another way in this editor, which is nice, is that if you put your cursor near the container, it highlights it in red where the other container is. It also has a line on the side with this minus. If I click on that minus there, it actually closes that part of the code up. That could be something that's useful later. All right, so we have a list of names. Now, what do we want to do with our program? Let's do something really basic. We'll just say we're going to make a for loop here, and we're just going to print out the names. So we're going to say for name in list of names. You can also see here that this particular editor has offered for me something that I already wrote, and otherwise a list of useful things based on this programming language. So I could have while typing list of names, I could have hit tab, and it would have completed it for me because it was highlighted. All right, so here's some syntax from Python. So for name and list of names, now we need a colon. All right. Now, in this loop, in Python, you don't have curly braces in your definitions or to contain your code structure. Your code structure is contained through spacing. You can use any number of spaces or tabs, but they have to be consistent. So when you go from one line to a subline that's within some contained section, it has to be spaced or tabbed out in the same way every time. So I always use tabs. Some people like to use 4 spaces. They're equivalent in length, but you can't mix them. You can't use tab on one line and 4 spaces on the next because Python doesn't like that. So for name and list of names, we're going to just say print name. And the print statement here is a function. It has to have parentheses for it to execute. You also notice a lot of programming languages, you might have to put like a semicolon at the end of your line. That is not the case with Python. If you put a semicolon there, Python just ignores it. But I will ignore it here because there's no point in adding one. But you won't ever have a code that doesn't function because of a missing semicolon. You might have one that doesn't function because you forgot to put your colon here after a list of names, but that's not the case here. We're going to save this, and we're going to go to our terminal. And so I made this file inside the folder that's called Python project, and that's where I'm running my terminal now. So Python, and that's how we would normally do the interactive session, but actually that's not what I want to do here. So I'm going to exit, and instead to run the program, I'll type Python space and the name of the program, which is my program.py. Now what I did there is I hit tab to autocomplete it, which is something the terminal can do. All right, if I run that, boom, it executes my program and it prints out the names, Bob, Jim, Frank. It prints them in the order that I wrote them. Okay, so that program worked. You might have just written your first program, but whoop-de-doo, right? Who cares? Now, what if instead of the list of names being a list, it was a tuple? So if we add a open parenthesis there and a close parenthesis there, now we have a list of names. Let's call it tup of names. And we'll change this to be tup of names. Let's just see, we'll save that. We're going to see if this runs, just for fun. I can hit the up arrow in the terminal window, Python myprogram.py, enter, and it runs exactly the same. Because both are lists, they're 0 indexed, they're iterable, meaning you can loop through them, but you can't append to a tuple. So let's go back. I'm going to hit the Control Z here to go back to the list. All right, square brackets there. Save. So this is back to our list of names. Now, let's say we had more data that came in. Okay, list of names dot append, and we're going to append the name. Golly, Steve. All right, so we're going to add Steve to the list of names. This part of the program down here is still the same. Now, we can say this instead, though. We're going to add some logic now. So you might notice a couple of things. One, for the for loop, all I had to do was indent the program, and it ran. If I duplicate this line and I say print name, now it's going to print the name twice, which is fine. We could do that. In between that, we can print the, we'll say list of names dot index, and inside of the parentheses of index we're going to have name. So what we're asking here is we're saying print the index associated with the name that's in the list of names. So it should be printing 0, 1, 2, 3 in this case, because we have 4 names. So starting with a 0 index, it should go from 0 to 3, and it should print the name, the index, and then the name again. So we made that change there. We got to make sure you got all the right amount of parentheses there. But let's see if this executes the way we think. So Bob 0 Bob, Jim 1 Jim, Frank 2 Frank, Steve 3 Steve. Just as we imagined. All right, let's add a little bit of logic to this now. We can say, well, first off, let's take this list of names.index and let's define at the beginning of our code, we'll say idx equals list of names dot index name. So we're defining idx as the index as whatever the index of that name is for the current iteration of the loop. And now we'll put in some logic and we'll say if idx equals double equals 2, then print this is index 2. Okay, that's easy enough. And we'll save that, and then we'll run the program, and we'll see what happens. And we have Bob 0 Bob, Jim 1 Jim. This is index 2, Frank 2 Frank, Steve 3 Steve. So the rest of the code executed as normal when the logic was true, right? What do we have there? We say if index equals 2, equal 2. And so another way of saying that is an if statement is looking for if true, and then it runs something else. We can also add to the if statement. We can say else, meaning in all other cases, we have a colon there, and we can print not index 2. And now, what will happen? I wonder. It prints not index 2, Bob 0 Bob, not index 2, Jim 1 Jim. This is index 2, Frank 2 Frank, not index 2, Steve 3 Steve, right? So this has been a very simple program to show how to print to the screen, to run through a loop, and to use some logic. I wanted to show a few more ways of using loops because there are several different ways to do this, and I don't want to leave us out to dry. I'm going to do something now where I'm just going to take this list of names and I'm going to do something called Control Q, which in this editor will just comment it out. So it adds this number sign, which in Python the number sign is a way to make that line a comment line, meaning the code doesn't recognize it. All right, so save that. If I run the program now, it doesn't do anything because there's nothing to run. Okay. Another way to make a loop would be to say for I in range, and now we need a range. Well, one way to get the length of a list of names, say in this case, is to use a Python function called len. So we'll say len, and then we'll open close parentheses. So what do we want the length of? We want the length of the list of names. Oops. Okay. So this is actually a little akin to some programming that is more traditional. Usually when you're making a loop in other programming languages, a lot of times you'll have some kind of integer defined iterator for that particular loop. And in this case, we're creating an iterator. We're calling it I. We're using a function in Python called range and a function called len. The range function returns a list of numbers in the range that you give it. So if you give it the range 5, it'll return 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? A zero index list, a zero index range starting from that's in this case the length is whatever the list of names is. So len returns the length of the names as an integer. range returns an indexed list starting from 0. And the range function actually is, we can just show some examples here. We can say print range 4, right? And then we can also print range. And so the other nice thing about this editor is you can see it right here. It gives you a definition. So for range, it only requires this first input, which is the start, but you can also input other things. You could input a stop and a step, meaning I could say, what if I want to start with index 1? Well, I wouldn't just put range 1, I would put range 1, comma, maybe 5, and that means it's going to stop at 5, meaning it's actually going to stop at 4, I believe. And then I say 1 again, which again, 1 is the predefined iteration. But if I wanted to iterate by 2, let's make it a little more interesting. I'll go to 11. 1 to 11 by 2. Put the right number of parentheses there. So let's comment out this part right here, and we'll just look at what these range prints do. Did it do anything? It didn't do anything. All right. Oh, well, I'm not sure exactly why that is, but so we can say print I for I in range 4. And here we'll say print bracket I for I in range. Okay. So let's see if Python likes that better. All right, so 0, 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Okay. So what did we do? Let's take a look again. So I guess the first one didn't work because I don't know what range naturally returns. But so what I did is I put in brackets and I created a list, and I put a for loop into the list, which is something that people often call that Pythonic, to make something that can execute you can write in one line. So what I made a list, and I said, take that list and give me I for I in range 4. And so I in range 4 returns 0, 1, 2, 3. So, and this is just saying I for I in range 4. So it returns 0, 1, 2, 3. Then secondly, the second line is print I for I in range, starting from 1, going to 11, and count by 2. That's what those 3 parameters mean there. So it started from 1, and it gave me all the numbers counting from 1 to 11, stopping at 11, meaning it stopped at the range stopped at 10 because 11 is like the backstop. So it didn't include 11, but it counted by 2. So it gave me 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. So this can be useful using the I in range. It can be useful in Python if you want to have the index associated with the name. So in the first list, I said for name and list of names. In this case, I'm saying for I in range length list of names or len list of names, we can say print list of names, square bracket, I. Okay, so this should actually execute and give us the same functionality as our first program did. It's going to print those 2 ranges ahead of that, but then Bob, Jim, Frank, Steve. So it functions in the same way as the first list did before I added the if statements, but it executes. It produces the same output, which just shows that there's dozens of different ways you can code the same program, and none of them are correct. What's correct is if it prints to the screen what you wanted it to print to the screen. It will do what you tell it to do, but it doesn't always do what you want it to do, and that's the thing about programming. We can even add our logic here. If in this case we don't have to define the index as the list of names dot index of the name because we've already have the index as I. And that might be the reason that you want to program this way. So you could say if I equals to And in this case, we'll just change the logic. We're going to tab this into that logic, right? So that tab, that spacing convention, it works the same for loops or logic. And you can see that it nests. So we're going to print the list of names I, and we know that for I equal 2, that the name is Frank, right? And so we can add another logic. If name equal Frank, colon, and what do we say? Print yes. Okay, so you can see that we've nested extra logic here just to be silly. And so what is this going to print? Oh no, name is not defined. All right, so I got a little cocky there. So, that's right, because I'm not using the previous one. That would have worked in my code above there, but here I had to say if list of names I equals Frank, print yes. So there it is. It just prints Frank, and it prints yes because those two things were true. And I can add a statement here. Well, it doesn't matter. All right, I think that's plenty for loops and logic. And hopefully now you understand a little bit about the Python structure in a code. You understand about adding tabs when you want to add a loop or add logic. You understand two different ways to make a for loop. You can use an iterator that references the length of a list. You can just say for item in list and then use the item in the as it goes through the list. You've done some logic. There's if, there's else. One thing I didn't cover, which is the else if. So I will cover that really quickly then. In this case, we're going to do it for this first if, and we're going to say else if, which is just elif. And now we need to input a new logical test. So we can say list of names I equals double equals Bob. So that's our test. We're going to print it was Bob. All right. And so that should print first because the first name in the list of names is Bob. Okay. So let's see what happens here. So it prints our two ranges. It was Bob. Frank, yes. Okay. So like I said, hopefully you've come to understand a little bit about loops, about logic, about the structure of Python, about the tabbing and spacing, and you can see again that I've got my everything in my for loop has to be one tab out at least. And then if there is a new loop or a new logic, it has to tab out from there. So I have an if statement and it tabs out. I have a second if statement, it tabs out again for that print yes. And then to make this elif associated with the first if statement, it has to be at the same tab, the same spacing. So, and thankfully the code draws this nice line down. It also has these little collapsibles here to show me what's inside this statement. So thank you for watching, and hopefully you understand about loops and logic. We'll see you in the next tutorial series.